Good morning. As mentioned, my name is Robert Pearlman. I'm the editor of and founder of collectSPACE. So 25 years ago, I set up collectSPACE.com with the intention of no one ever seeing it. I was a professional web developer developing space websites for clients, as you heard, including Buzz Aldrin and the National Space Society, and I needed a place to basically be a playground where I could test different designs and layouts, as well as I was getting ready to move. I had a small space memorabilia collection, and I decided, well, I'm a web guy, I'll create a web catalog of my collection. But it wasn't meant for anyone to see. Somehow someone did. And this was in the days before Google, so I don't know to this day how they did, but they wrote me and said, hey, I'm a space memorabilia collector and I know a few others. Can you create, are you going to continue to do this site? Can you support us in some way to let us meet online? And so I started developing tools for the community to come together, and we brought together, initially by the end of that first 6-month period, 500 space collectors. Today we have 350,000 registered members and a combined readership with syndication of 4.5 million monthly. So I'm going to go through, over the past 25 years since this past July, 5 lessons that we've learned towards the preservation of space history. Each of these probably could be a talk upon themselves, but if there's time afterwards, we can always discuss further. So to begin, to preserve space history, we need to understand space history. This seemed like a fairly obvious thing to understand, but when within the first couple of years of running collectSPACE, it became apparent that not everyone who was collecting space memorabilia paid attention to the history that they were collecting. It seemed like a divide that I didn't think needed to be addressed, but it was, there was a segment of the people that were collecting that couldn't tell you why John Glenn was any different than Story Musgrave, but they wanted both their autographs. Or why the piece of space hardware they had in their collection needed to be preserved and conserved, even though it wasn't in a museum, for future generations, rather than just be something to cut apart or to add autographs to. And so, in addition to that, the space history community got a view of collectSPACE, and I started getting emails from curators and historians and authors and saying, hey, we don't have a place to meet online. Can you expand to the larger space history topics? And so we integrated space history with space memorabilia, putting the space history topics before and above just the collection of space memorabilia as a means of prioritizing that you should understand the history you're collecting before you collect it. And it merged the two communities together. And really made a difference, I think, as we saw space collectors. We now have a count of 20 of them who had never written before, now have written books through the University of Nebraska's Outward Odyssey series and through other publishers, documenting different aspects of space exploration. But a little bit of what's more concerning about this topic is that NASA doesn't always understand this as well. And I'm not coming down on any one particular individual. I know these are complex issues, but in writing about the different artifacts that have been no longer needed by NASA over the years, we've come across this common response when they start to take apart items. On the left here, that is the left, right? That is the Pad 39B lightning mast that sat atop that pad for 40 years. It was, to give you an idea of a size, it is 80 feet tall. It's the same size as the Mercury Redstone. So when they were bringing it down, we said, well, what are you going to do with it? It's a perfect size to stand in like the Kennedy Space Center rocket park or any rocket park around the country. It can fit on a truck. It's movable. And they said, oh, we're cutting that apart. Oh, well, why? But because we have another one. And that was the one sitting on pad 39A. But tracking the history of this, if you're familiar with the history of the Apollo program, throughout Apollo there was never a lightning mast on top of the service structures. It was not until Apollo 12 was hit by lightning twice that they figured out, oh, we need lightning protection. And it took them until the Apollo-Soyuz test project in 1975 to install a lightning mast, that lightning mast on top of the tower. And so there was a story to be told with it. And yet it got cut apart, even though there were interested parties in displaying it. On the right, sorry, is a part of the tail cone that helped ferry the space shuttles to their museum homes at the end of the space shuttle program. When they flew Endeavour out to California, they used that tail cone and took it off of Endeavour, and then took Endeavour to the California Science Center. The tail cone was left at LAX. And it became obvious that NASA didn't have a plan for bringing it back to the East Coast. Boeing said it would cost close to $200,000 to fly it back to the East Coast. And so we stepped forward with a group of sponsors to acquire it and take it to an LA warehouse and save it. It was potentially going to be the centerpiece of a traveling exhibit. And then eventually the idea came, well, we've got a space shuttle mock-up out front of this building that does not have a tail cone, and it would be a great idea to put a tail cone on it, because that's how it flew on top of the 747. So we had pledged that we would pay for the transport in order for it to be installed on the shuttle here. Unfortunately, they said that a storm was approaching Kennedy Space Center where it sat, and NASA actually did end up paying to fly it back to Kennedy Space Center. They said because collectSPACE wasn't a 501c3, they couldn't just give it to us. And so about 2 weeks before a planned auction that we were going to take part in to buy it as surplus, they destroyed it because it was FOD. It was foreign object debris that could be picked up by the wind and potentially hurt buildings in the area. And so today, that's all that remains of the tail cone. And we also traced it back. This was the original tail cone that was used in the approach and landing tests with Enterprise. Number two, collectors are a valuable asset in preserving space history. As mentioned earlier, once we started to introduce the idea that the history of the object was as important as the object itself, collectors got really involved in wanting to preserve the pieces and apply museum grade preservation techniques to what they were displaying in their homes, or more, as I'll touch in a moment, in other venues. The problem is that there's not a lot of guides, there's not a lot of opportunities for collectors to learn those techniques or what are best practices. We've tried to publish some on collectSPACE. We've gotten curators in touch with collectors and conservators in touch with collectors. But now I think the larger community of space collectors around the world understand that they are just custodians of the pieces they have for the short time that they have them, and that they will eventually end up in public hands, and so need to be protected. But there's a value to having them in private hands and not just in museums. They reach audiences and sometimes are found and recovered because they are collectible. Here you see me with Rick Dale at his shop for the show American Restoration. That is a Gemini astronaut maneuvering unit that was found, one of two of them that was found in a junkyard here in Houston. They were sealed in crates, no labels on the outside. A collector went to the junkyard, asked if they had any space stuff. He said no, but you can take a look around. He pried open one of the boxes and saw the maneuvering unit inside, recognized exactly what it was. I said there were two of them. He bought both of them. One of them is now on display at the Stafford Air and Space Museum, and the other is in a private collection who has the largest collection of jet packs in the world. That is the one that's pictured. And then it went on national television and was exposed to millions of viewers. And that piece will eventually end up in a museum at some point. Antiques Roadshow, the same story. You have pieces that have come out of the woodwork. In that case, it was Apollo 11 pieces, including the decals from the outside of the Apollo 11 command module, which were thought to be lost, but had been saved by the gentleman you see standing there, who was a Rockwell employee, who was on the recovery team and took them off the spacecraft and saved them because he was told to throw them away. And it reaches the next generation. That is an authentic Apollo command module parachute that you see there that was just recently auctioned at Sotheby's. But in order to get photos for the catalog, they needed to deploy it. And what better way to deploy it than to bring it to a schoolyard and have all the kids hold it up and do what they do with parachutes that they buy for gymnastic activities, but with a real command module. And there will be those kids will grow up with that memory, and who knows, maybe the next, maybe inspired to go into STEM activities as a result. Space artifact thieves say the darndest things. From the very beginning, collectSPACE, we promoted a responsible collecting approach, which meant that before you even went into the history of the piece in terms of what it was used in space for and which astronaut touched it or whatever, that if you were collecting artifacts, that you first needed to have a chain of ownership and make sure that that you could legally own it. There were some gray area in this, and that's in part why in 2012 a law was passed to sort of clear that up. NASA did not want to start suing its astronauts, but it did, because they were coming out of the woodwork with items that there was no paperwork for that they could have kept, and they were selling them for hundreds of thousands of dollars, and so there was public pressure to recover the items. And so Congress got together and passed a law that said, if you're a Mercury, Gemini, or Apollo astronaut and you saved items off the spacecraft, with the exception of loose lunar material, they were yours to keep. And so that's how some of these items have entered legally into private hands. Others are through government surplus auctions and through museums that have closed over the years. And NASA, even some of the items loaned to or provided to museums have a 13-year or sometimes 5-year expiration where museums can then sell them to better their collections or trade them or barter them. So on the site, we've always promoted that you should, do this legally. And yet every week I receive emails from people saying, hey, you want to buy a moon rock? I'm not exaggerating. Last night I got the latest one with pictures of a moon rock that they wanted to sell to me. And in 99% of those cases, it's not a moon rock. And I have to just direct them to say, if you're sure this is from the moon, then go to your local university and look up, and go to the geology department, have them test it for you. But if they test it and it's of lunar origin, they are going to contact NASA. That'll be the next call. But every so often, a real moon rock steps out of the woodwork. And in fact, there was one, like the one pictured here in a lucite ball, that presented itself to me about 20 years ago. They wanted to sell it to me. They would not provide full details. I started my own little sting operation saying that I had a buyer interested. We went as far as him negotiating the price and then saying, well, where should we meet? In Dubai. I realized I was a little bit over my head, so I contacted NASA, the Office of Inspector General, who got the CIA and the FBI involved, and they tried through emails being sent through my account to lure him here to the United States. They were unsuccessful in doing that, so they decided to set up a meeting in Dubai at the Dubai airport. The problem was my picture is all over collectSPACE, so they couldn't have someone play me. They could have someone play my buyer, and so they had to have me agree to go to Dubai. And that's when it got really interesting, because they then were able to, they got a wiretap, they got the permission to wiretap this guy and look into his emails, and it found out that this moon rock was in the possession of a known affiliate of Al-Qaeda. And then they asked me, are you comfortable in going to this meeting? And I said, it's not a question of if I'm comfortable, it's a question if my mom is comfortable. Because if she's not comfortable and I go, she's going to kill me. I also said, there's this obvious problem. My last name is Pearlman. They know who I am. But I ultimately agreed, and he got cold feet and never showed up. He disappeared before we even left for the airport. But the other items pictured here, we've recovered. The flag and the patch there were onboard Challenger during the SDS-51L accident. It was mounted to be presented to Ronald Reagan, the president at the time, and showed up at auction from a gentleman who worked at NASA headquarters, actually his family. And we have not been able to learn how it got or why it ended up in his personal possessions and never presented to the President of the United States. But through the help of the National Air and Space Museum, we learned that there was record of one being prepared, a plaque being prepared for him, and there was and working with the Ronald Reagan Museum, we learned that it should be in their collection. And so it was returned to them. And then the centerpiece here is Don Isley's Speedmaster, that he, one of two that he had on board that flew on Apollo 7 and was loaned from the Air and Space Museum to a museum in Ecuador, was stolen from that museum, and then 30 years later showed up at a watch collector's show where someone was offering it for sale, disappeared for a couple of weeks, and then showed up again in an email to me from someone who was being offered it for sale saying, can you authenticate this for me? And so we ran a small sting operation, then got larger again. This time it worked. The FBI was able to reclaim the piece, and it was returned to the Smithsonian. Historical value does not always or often equal market value. This was something of a surprise. I thought if you were collecting space history, you would understand that the most valuable pieces would be the pieces that that made the most history. And in some ways that works out. Like the holy grail for space collectors is something that was flown on Apollo 11, taken out onto the surface, coated in moon dust, and then brought back to Earth, kept by the astronauts, sold at auction, totally legal, and that's and that would be the most valuable piece out there. And there is exactly one of those items in private hands, a little paper clip. But anything that's been to the moon is sort of tops the list. Anything that's been touched by moon dust tops the list among collectors. But there's a lot of things that make absolutely no sense from a history versus market perspective. Right now we're facing a situation where, well, it's not a situation, it's just a market that's grown, whether it's grown naturally or with help, we don't know, but NASA photo prints, vintage NASA photo prints, glossies that were printed out onto Kodak paper and given out to the press to reprint in their magazines and newspapers and given out to the public, literally thousands at times reproduced, as little as 20 years ago sold for $1 or $2 each. I had boxes of them. And today, if you have particular shots, let's say Apollo 8's Earthrise, with a red with a stamp on it that has the NASA ID number in red ink, that's a $40,000 to $50,000 piece. And the funny part about that is if it has blue ink, it's like a $5,000 piece. And I say it's funny because we did research and found out that the color means absolutely nothing. It was just what the operator of the machine put into the ink cartridge that day. But no matter how many times we've explained that on the site, no one seems to get it, and they want red lettered numbers. So here's a little quiz. There's 3 pieces, all related to Apollo 11. The first is a piece of the Wright flyer that Neil Armstrong brought to the moon and back. So it's got double the history, first powered flying aircraft and also first landing on the moon. You have Buzz Aldrin's in-flight coveralls, his jacket that he wore on the mission, and you have the gold medallion, one of 3 belonging to Neil Armstrong that he carried on the flight. Each of the crew members had one. One of them is worth $275,000, one of them is worth $2 million, and one of them is worth $2.8 million. Anyone want to take a guess? Okay. So the Wright flyer material is $275,000. The jacket is $2.8 million, and the gold coin is $2 million. And the idea, to me, maybe it's just me, but I've heard other collectors and other people say it, that a commemorative coin would outsell pieces of the Wright flyer carried on the first, with that much of a separation, seems to show that there's a separation between the historical value and the market value for space artifacts. And for my final point, what the internet hath given, the internet may taketh away. And this is the lesson I think we're now starting to learn, and little is being done about it. And this is something I'm going to put out a call of action to everyone that I speak to. And that is, with the advent of social media and the use by NASA and other organizations of it, the ability to look up what happened at the time that news was made is becoming harder and harder to do, even just 5 years out. If you want to see where NASA announced that they had discovered water ice on the moon water ice on Mars by the Phoenix lander, you have to find the tweet that they put out about it, because they didn't put out a press release until a week later. The initial announcement was made on Twitter. But finding that tweet, you can't Google for it, you can't use Twitter's own search engine for it, unless you have a direct link to it or someone else referenced a direct link to it, you'd never find that original announcement. And that's going to make it very difficult for historians and others in the future to be able to track the history of how discoveries and missions unfolded. But it's not just a matter of Twitter and social media, it's also that because of the way that the digital world works, and I know this is something odd for someone who actually works as on the web and makes his living there, our history is disappearing with a whim. If a website goes offline, there's very little that can be done. And the Internet Archive is great, but the Wayback Machine is not complete. And so this is what happens more often than not in trying to find even recent space history as we do research. I think there needs to be a way for the space history community, and maybe even the larger history community in total, to come together and say, we need a national approach to archiving at least the activities that are making history. And so finally, I said this was our 25th anniversary. I want to leave you with 2 surprises, or 2 reveals. First, this is our logo, designed a number of years ago. It wasn't the original logo with the site, but the logo type at the bottom dates back to 1999. It tells the story of how we are progressing. We're a site of the shuttle era, but we study the Apollo era and we look to the future. And the future of collectSPACE is not just online, it's now going to be expanding into video and film. And so this is a first look at our studio bug. There we go. And there'll be some real great music behind that too. And then wait, I got one more surprise. I'm going to test all of your ability when you leave today during the break at how much you want to preserve history versus enjoy history. I brought a little souvenir of our 25th anniversary. You're the first people to receive them. This is the collectSPACE branded M&Ms, real M&Ms that are packaged. They have the collectSPACE logos on them. They have 25 years and the words collectSPACE as well as the M's in our site colors, and each of you will get a package.